So today we're going to talk about Islamophobia and jihad. This is a topic I'm still learning a lot about myself, and I'll just tell you a quick story about why it's so important. I remember a couple years ago I got to go to a meeting of sort of the top religious scholars in the country. It's called the American Academy of Religion. And I'd started to teach world religions, and so I was really interested in Islam. Islam is one of my favorite religions to study and learn more about. And so I went to a couple of lectures on Islam, really excited to kind of delve deep into this faith. And hearing the stories of Muslim scholars talk about what it's like to be Muslim, and not only about the prevalence of Islamophobia, but how tired they were of dealing with Islamophobia, really caught me off guard. The biggest problem is there's just a lack of information. Most folks in our country, if you watched the first two lectures of this unit, you are way more educated than most people in our country about Islam. If you watched the film The Message, you are way more educated about Islam than most folks in our country, unfortunately, and there's just a lot of misconceptions about Islam. So Islamophobia is very real, and we're going to talk about two things today. First, we're going to talk about Islamophobia, and then we're going to talk about jihad. And what does jihad mean? It's another very misunderstood concept. So, to start, let's talk about what is Islam. Islam is sometimes translated as the peace that brings submission. The word Islam can be broken down into as the word peace or the word submission. So sometimes scholars like to describe it as the peace that brings, or the submission that brings peace. You can think of it either way. So, or the peace that comes from submission might be a better way to say it. So out of submission to God comes peace. You could think of it as simply submission. The core value of Islam could be considered submission. Or not maybe the core, but unique value of Islam is submission. And we talked about the goal of Judaism as being ethical monotheism. Hopefully in some of your other classes you've talked about the goal of Christianity, which is to bring about the kingdom of God or the reign of God on earth. The goal of Islam is to bring peace. That's it. The goal of Islam is to bring peace both inwardly and outwardly. And one of the most important things to understand is that Muslims are faithful citizens. That Muslims are just as American as anyone in this country. In fact, in some cases, they're great Americans who go above and beyond. Many of them serve in our military. And we need to recognize that we have many Muslim Americans who are great citizens in this country, and that's often lost. People assume that if you're Muslim, you're trying to infiltrate our country, and you can imagine how you would feel if someone thought that about you. Let's talk about a couple of misconceptions about Islam. First, there's this myth that Muslims suppress women. And the people who have expressed the most outrage about this are Muslim women. And Muslim women I've talked to about this really make it a point to say, this is my choice to be Muslim. No one is forcing me to do this. Just a quick fact that many people aren't aware of. 40% of Muslim women in the United States have a college degree, compared to 29% of the general populations. That means on average, Muslim women are more educated than the general population of women in our country. The only other religion that comes close is Judaism, and that goes Judaism and then Islam for educated women. There's also a myth that Muslims are all from the Near East. They're all from Arabia. Certainly the religion was founded on the Arabian Peninsula. But in fact, Islam is the most diverse religion in our country. So amongst Muslims, 28% are white, 35% are African American, 18% are Asian, and 18% have some other heritage. Compare that to Protestants, where 88% of Protestants are white and 8% are African American. Or Catholics, who 76% are white, 11% are Latino, and 7% are something else. So by far in our country, Muslims are the most diverse group of people. Muslims are more diverse than any other faith. So I'd like to introduce you, if you haven't heard of this fellow before. His name is Peter King. He's currently the chair of the Committee on Homeland Security. So he's a congressman, and not only a congressman, but chair of the Committee on Homeland Security. So fairly prevalent, he's doing good for himself. Very influential, and he works with Homeland Security. In 2004, King, in an interview with a radio host, said, "No American Muslim leaders are cooperating in the war on terror." And then he went on to say this: 80 to 85% of mosques in this country are controlled by Islamic fundamentalists. This is an enemy living amongst us. 80 to 85% of mosques in this country are controlled by Islamic fundamentalists. That statistic is remarkable. And I'm going to show you a video just so you can see how he responds to this, just so you can get a sense of what he says. So here's a quick little news clip just to see, when asked about this, what he says, and notice the way he talks.
Coming up in our next half hour, a former general who went to Capitol Hill to call for Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld's resignation. Plus, a congressman who claims that 80 to 85% of mosques in this country are controlled by Islamic extremists. Our top story coverage moves now to the controversy here in Washington over one key congressman's claims about Muslims in this country. Representative Peter King, the chairman of the House Homeland Security Committee, has said that the vast majority of mosques here in the U.S. are controlled by Muslim extremists. And that's only the beginning of the charges he's making, charges that are causing a lot of outrage. Jason Carroll has more.
It's the holy month of Ramadan, and this is the image Muslims here say truly reflects who they are: law-abiding, peaceful people. Not as their own congressman claimed in a recent campaign letter, part of an Islamic threat that could cause another 9/11. And New York Republican Peter King has also said, according to law enforcement sources he spoke with, 85% of mosques in the United States, including this one, are run by extremists.
Where is this 85%? Who did the study? On what basis? What questions were asked? And how did you come up with this number?
Several members of the mosque agreed to speak to us about the claim.
It's very painful to have a senior politician to make those statements without really having any direct interaction with the community.
You have extremists in basically any community, any belief system. So what? You deal with them accordingly.
A federal law enforcement official agrees that there are some extremists in American mosques, but dismisses the validity of 85%, saying it was much too high.
Do you actively try to seek out those who may have extreme thoughts or extreme points of view?
Do we conduct interviews with all the people who come in and out? No. But if we hear something, and I haven't heard anything yet, believe me, I'll be the first to call the FBI.
There's another concern King has raised. He says the mosque fosters 9/11 conspiracy theories that the CIA or Zionists may have been behind the attacks, so Muslims here wonder why focus on them. The national director of the Council on American Islamic Relations says this is about King trying to win re-election.
It's very disturbing to see a member of the United States Congress exploit the anti-Muslim prejudice and fear within the society just to get a few more votes and some money.
So during this holiest of months for Muslims, some here will be praying for forgiveness and the hope there will be more understanding. Jason Carroll, CNN, New York.
And joining me now, the man stirring up all the controversy, Representative Peter King. Welcome. Representative King, I want to start off by reading from a letter that you wrote to your constituents this month. And you said, because I have put aside political correctness and spoken out against these radical leaders, I have been denounced by Muslim organizations as a Muslim hater. Are you a Muslim hater?
Absolutely not. In fact, I work very closely with a number of Muslims, but you were talking there to the Islamic Center of Long Island, which I actually had a very close relationship prior to September 11th. But despite what people like Dr. Khan were telling you tonight, the fact is throughout the fall of 2001, people like Ghazi Khan, who was the interfaith director of that mosque, said that there was no proof that Al-Qaeda or Muslims had attacked the mosque. He said that Muhammad Atta was alive and well in Emirates, that two of the other hijackers were alive in Saudi Arabia, that the FBI knew this and was covering it up. And he also said that the Zionists, the Jews, could well have been responsible for it. The co-president of that mosque was peddling the rumor that Mossad was behind it all. Dr. Khan, who you saw tonight, was the president-elect at the time and the most prominent spokesman at the mosque. He never once, during that entire time, in any way rebuked Ghazi Khan, who stayed on as the interfaith director, and today as an individual is still saying the Mossad could have been behind the attacks. And my basis for the 85% was Sheikh Kabani, who was one of the leading Muslims in this country back in the year 2000, said that he thought at least 80% of the mosques were taken over by extremist leaders, by radical Muslims.
All right.
And that has been my experience.
But we heard him also say those numbers are absolutely preposterous. You still stand by that 85% statistic?
I'm saying that Sheikh Kabani, who was, again, he testified back in the year 2000 and said that. And I'm telling you, I know of any number of mosques in New York where the police are very concerned about them, where there are radicals in there. And absolutely, yes, I stand by that number. It was 80% back in 2000. Based on the radicalization since then, it has to be, I have no doubt, I have no problem at all in saying it's 85%. If it's not 85, all right, it's still 80.
Let me close with this. You just heard in Jason Carroll's piece that Muslim leaders are accusing you of stoking this kind of fear to get elected and fund your campaign. Your reaction to that?
Absolutely untrue. I've been
Your
saying
opponent thinks that's the case.
I've been saying this I can say what he wants. I've been saying this for a number of years. I've been in this debate with people like Dr. Khan and the Islamic Center of Long Island going back 2, 3, 4 years. What they did was absolutely outrageous. I've said this time and time again. This is nothing new. What I've been saying now is consistent with what I've been saying for the last several years. And Dr. Khan comes out of a mosque where his interfaith director said that the CIA and the FBI were behind what was happening. They knew that Mohammed Atta was still alive, that he knew that the other 2 hijackers were still alive in Saudi Arabia, and he implied that the Zionists, that's the Jews, the Israelis, were behind that attack. Dr. Khan never once rebuked him, never once.
All right, we've got to leave it there. Congressman King, thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Thank you, Paul.
Next is the situation in Murfreesboro, Tennessee, where a group of Muslims, Sunni Muslims, were building the Islamic Center of Murfreesboro. And you can see right away on that sign, it says, "Not welcome." You know, somebody vandalized their sign. There's been tremendous opposition in the community. People have accused the board members, or one board member in particular, as being a Muslim fundamentalists and associating with the Muslim Brotherhood. They were accused of distributing literature from the Muslim Brotherhood, which is a fundamentalist group in the Near East. And the folks from this center have said, where are these allegations coming from? They're trying to build what is basically a community center like any other church, and have received tremendous opposition from the community. And here's a brief clip from Anderson Cooper that you can watch just to get a sense of what the discussion has been like about Murfreesboro, Tennessee, and the mosque built there.
This mosque in Murfreesboro, Tennessee, what evidence do you have the imam who has condemned Hamas to the Christian Broadcasting Network and Hezbollah, to the vast majority of Muslims who have practiced there for years and years, what evidence do you have that they are recruiting or fomenting terror?
In the past, there hasn't been a problem, but Anderson, with the recent statement by Massad Rawash on his MySpace page, gives rise to huge concern in our community.
Again, which he was removed from the board for and then investigated apparently by the mosque. I don't know the details of that, but what is on somebody's MySpace page and what they, you know. So your sole opposition to this mosque is the fact that this board member had something on his MySpace page.
Yes, his MySpace page, and Dr. Balul for teaching at a mosque in Irving, Texas that is under investigation for terrorist-related activities.
Okay, so there's 2 reasons why you're opposed to this mosque. One, because the imam of this mosque used to preach at another mosque that you say is under investigation, and because a board member has something on his MySpace page.
Yes,
that's the sole. That's it.
That's enough. That is enough.
Right after we finished taping the interview, we made some calls. First, we got in touch with a local reporter who's been covering the story. He confirms that the board member in question, Massad Rawash, was investigated by the FBI because of allegations about statements on a MySpace page. No charges, however, were ever brought, and he was reinstated by the mosque. Then we contacted the FBI about Ms. Cardoso-Moore's allegation that a mosque in Irving, Texas, where the Murfreesboro imam was once a visiting cleric, is or was under investigation by the FBI for terrorism-related activities. Actually, she said it is currently under investigation. The source we spoke to was unaware of the allegations about the mosque in Irving, was not aware of what Ms. Cardoso-Moore was talking about. Joining us now is a spokeswoman for the Murfreesboro Islamic Center. Approval to build this. Are you going to go ahead and build this despite, what's going on?
Absolutely. Like I said, the supporters that are behind us far outnumber those who are opposed to us. We feel very good about our neighbors. We feel good that they're trying to support us. And we really don't want to focus on the negativity of those who try to become vigilantes and take the law into their own hands and set fire to equipment and threaten us, things like that. So absolutely, we plan on moving forward.
And at this point, I would encourage you to take just a couple-minute break to check out your worksheet, get a glass of water or something, and then come back to the lecture. Then we have the Park 51 Ground Zero Mosque, which, if you had read a little bit of the news when this was coming out a couple years ago, tremendous opposition to building a mosque 2 blocks away from the former site of the World Trade Center, Ground Zero. Obviously, I remember 9/11 very well. I remember what it was like to live through that day. But the assumption that Muslims are automatically associated with terrorists who attacked our country is unfair. And we don't seem to do that with other religious groups. When terrorists from our own country do acts of terrorism, people who were raised in a Christian home, we don't usually say Christian terrorists attacked us. It's usually only Muslim terrorists, and it's very hard because there's so much emotion tied to what happened that day, and for people to make that automatic link of Islam equals terrorist really devalues the religion of Islam on the whole. Remember, there are about 1.5 billion Muslims on earth. If all Muslims are terrorists, that's 1.5 billion Muslims. If you even think about it for 5 seconds, it's ridiculous. It's more like 0.01% of the Muslim population is involved in some kind of terrorist group. I don't know for sure, but I'm guessing that Christians, probably about 0.01% of Christians also have some kind of issue. It's such a small percentage, but we don't associate it with Christianity, and we don't associate it with Judaism. We don't associate it with the other faiths. It's just Islam. And I think it's mostly because we don't understand Islam. And what kinds of things do they want to build at this Ground Zero mosque? Well, like the mosque at Murfreesboro, Tennessee, I have trouble pronouncing that. They wanted to build a mosque open and accessible to all, that also had a swimming pool, a basketball court, an auditorium, a library, a daycare facility, a restaurant, and a cooking school. This is one way in which our freedom of religion is being built on. And I'm going to quote Newt Gingrich, who's a very prominent Republican in our country, and what he said about this mosque. There should be no mosque near Ground Zero in New York, so long as there are no churches or synagogues in Saudi Arabia. That's a strange thing to say, that we're going to compare our religious freedom to the religious freedom in Saudi Arabia. The implication that people aren't free to worship whatever religion they want in the United States, or that our freedom is equivalent to that to a country which has a state-sponsored religion, which has always been unique about America. We don't have a state-sponsored religion. And he continues and says, the idea of a 13-story building set up by a group, many of whom, frankly, are very hostile to our civilization. And I'm talking now about the people who organized this, many of whom are apologists for Sharia, which is a form of law I think we cannot allow in this country, period. We're going to talk in a second about Sharia law, but this quote really shows that Newt Gingrich doesn't know what Sharia is, and I think misunderstands Sharia. And that's not to say that members of this mosque are apologists for Sharia. Members of the mosque are probably about as diverse opinions as the local Catholic Church, and we know how many different folks can be at a Catholic church. Many of us do, at least. This brings up a question. It's a theological question. Do Christians and Muslims worship the same God? For a long time, Jews and Christians have acknowledged that Muslims worship the same God. And a few years ago, Pope Benedict made a rather unfortunate comment in one of his speeches where he associated Islam with violence. And he was quoting a medieval philosopher in context. It kind of made sense. But I don't think he caught that when you say something and you're Pope, people don't hear the context, they just hear the soundbite, the brief phrase. So let's look at a quote of what Muslim scholars said in response to that. They got together, reflected on how can we respond to the Pope's words, And let me bring a quote from the document that they came up with. Muslims and Christians together make up well over half of the world's population. Without peace and justice between these two religious communities, there can be no meaningful peace in the world. It is part of the very foundational principles of both faiths, love of the one God and love of the neighbor. These principles are found over and over again in the sacred texts of Islam and Christianity. The unity of God, the necessity of love for Him, and the necessity of love of the neighbor is thus the common ground between Islam and Christianity. I think that's a wonderful statement. I find it very touching that Muslim scholars appeal to the love found in the God of both Christianity and Islam and says this needs to be our foundational principle, otherwise we will not achieve peace and justice in our world. Again, you see that goal of Islam, peace. Muslims are great Americans. They're great in other countries too. If you've ever met any Muslims or had Muslim friends, you'll know that they're pretty much like anybody else. Usually pretty nice people, sometimes not nice people, but it gets back to that whole idea of we always talk about us and them. And really we got to get to a place where it's not us and them, but it's just us. We're all people. And Islamophobia is a problem in our country. It's a big issue in our country. People believe that Islam is an inherently violent religion that turns to terrorists, and people believe that Islam is opposed to America, and people believe that Muslims foster Islam fosters terrorism. Nothing could be further from the truth. Muslims are great Americans. What is jihad? Jihad is one of the most misunderstood concepts in Islam. The word literally means struggle. The word jihad means struggle. And that's really what it is. It represents both an internal and external struggle that Muslims face to follow the will of God. If the goal of Islam is peace, why does it have a reputation for war? It's a fair question. If we really believe that Islam is a religion of peace, where did we get this idea that it has a reputation for war? Well, again, it's ignorance and lack of understanding, and this is one area where I think educating folks about Islam could really help us significantly. I like to show students in my class sometimes a clip of the West Wing where they had an episode talking about terrorism and Muslim extremists. And they make this comparison, and I really like it, and so I'll share it with you. They say Islamic terrorists are, or Islamic extremists are to Islam as what is to Christianity. They sort of give a pop quiz to some folks. And people say, fundamentalist Christians, and it's like, well, our fundamentalists may have some different beliefs from us, but they're not terrorists. The adequate metaphor for Christianity, and this helps me understand it as well, is the Ku Klux Klan, the KKK. Muslim extremists are to Islam as the KKK is to Christianity. And I don't think most Christians, whether you're a Christian yourself, you like Christianity, don't like Christianity, I don't think it would be fair to say all Christians are members of the Ku Klux Klan, which is virtually what we say when we say all Muslims are extremists. It's the same percentage even, if you look at even the KKK in its heyday compared to Christianity as Muslims to Islam, again, about 0.01%. In Judaism, you follow the Torah and there's argument about ethics. Remember, ethical monotheism is the goal of Judaism. In Christianity, we believe in Jesus and argue about theology. In Islam, though, submission to the 5 pillars is what's most important. And what do scholars argue? They argue about governance, about law, about how to rule. Remember, Muhammad was sort of both the sort of bishop and mayor of Medina. When he was alive, he eventually became to rule over the entire Arabian Peninsula. So unlike Jesus, and unlike Moses, Muhammad was a political ruler. This is a unique thing about Islam, and this is one thing that is very hard for Americans and some folks in Europe to understand. There's no separation between church and state in Islam. It just doesn't make sense to a Muslim mentality. If you're trying to bring about peace, why wouldn't you have God at the center of that peace? And for all the objections we raise in our head when we hear that, we need to realize that it's a cultural thing. It's an idea. It may be right, it may be wrong, but I think we need to show some openness in trying to understand Islam and trying to understand how that works. Even in a nation like Turkey, where there's elections and it's a democratic nation, there's still this very prevalent thought that Islam brings peace and that the best way to rule is to look at Islam. How does Islamic law or Sharia determine? Sharia is just a word that means law, and there's been a long history of Sharia law. I say Sharia law because that's what we say in the United States, even though that means law. It's like saying Allah God. Allah is God, God. But I do want to go over how they created laws in Sharia, and many countries in the world today still operate with Sharia law, but I really think it's interesting how they figure it out. So first I look to the Quran, and the Quran has some provisions for law and society. Then they turn to the Sunnah of the Prophet, which means, how did Muhammad act? What would Muhammad have done? So that's a really cool thing. Then they use analogical reasoning, they'll compare situations. But finally, and I think this is the most interesting one, consensus of the scholarly community, which means law is determined by scholars, Muslim scholars in different sort of universities coming together and agreeing, consensus, which means all of them agree. Just imagine if we determine laws by having scholars at universities come together and agree, and what an interesting process that would be, I think, both for the benefit and maybe some detriments. But Muhammad believed, my community will never agree on an error, will never agree on a mistake. There's a lot of faith in the movement of Islam that together, by thinking through everything, through scholarship, good laws can be determined. I think that's just a fascinating idea. So there are two sort of ways that we want to cover in Islam. There's Dar al-Islam and Dar al-Arb. Dar al-Islam is the way of a Muslim territory. Dar al-Arb is the way of a secular territory. Dar al-Islam, ruled by a Muslim ruler, consults with Muslim scholars. Dar al-Arb, look at this one. The priority, the hope, is that it's ruled by a Christian or Jew, but the secular territory can also be ruled by a pagan. Dar al-Islam is at peace. Dar al-Arb is at war. And so a lot of the time, Islam believes the way to bring about peace is through Islam. That Islam is the ultimate representation of peace, but peace can be achieved by a Christian or a Jewish person as well because of the submission to the one God. The normal way of operating is pretty similar to Christianity trying to bring about the kingdom of God. Christians go about trying to help people be more faithful people, believe in Jesus and his message, and experience the love of God. Islam tries to get people to understand the teachings of Muhammad, to follow the one true God, and follow the 5 pillars. Rarely is this done violently. In fact, only extremists will tend to do this violently. It's much more like Christianity. And I think Christianity certainly has had its dark periods, as Islam has had its dark periods. But the goals are very, very similar. So, the goal of Islam is peace. This is achieved both by an inner peace and an outer peace. The word jihad means struggle. struggle both within and struggle without. So there's a struggle in the interior of every person, and there's a struggle on the outside of the community. And that inner struggle is an inner jihad, that outer struggle is outer jihad. So inner peace is achieved with jihad, or struggle with the self, struggle submitting to God. The outer peace is jihad with non-Muslim communities, struggling to get folks to understand Islam and the basic principles of Islam. And in fact, in the Muslim Empire, even under the early days of the Caliphate, when they were still figuring out what to do, there was provisions for non-Muslims to live in the Muslim community. There were provisions for people who weren't Muslim to live at peace. And it was said that Islam should never be forced on anyone. No one should ever be compelled to be Muslim, which I find incredibly admirable. And you see this happening, if you've watched The Message yet, you see it happen all the time. No one ever forces anybody to be Muslim. Jihad with the self brings about inner peace. Jihad with non-Muslim communities brings outer peace. Jihad is a term that just means struggle. So struggling to bring about peace. It is not a war, and if there's ever a component that has war, it is always out of a defense. So, next class, we'll look at Hinduism. Thanks.